Chapter 34. The edge. The cutting edge. He could feel his strength flowing into the wakizashi blade, flowing along the cutting edge that could slice to the thickness of a shadow. His strength was in the kito with its fine masame grain, as clear as straight-grained wood. It gathered the light to itself, a bright sharpness that looked cold to the touch. The swords met and rang out over the rooftops. MacLeod felt the force behind the other man's blow. It was all he could do to contain it, take the sting out of the power by allowing the two blades to melt into one another. The Kurgan obviously saw that his adversary was surprised by the strength of his attack and followed up with two more hefty swings. But these were a little more clumsily delivered.
"This is no facial, eh?"
grunted the Kurgan. Both swordsmen knew the value of psychology. It was important to seem the more confident, the more knowing, more technically skilled. MacLeod knew that his face should give nothing away, impassive. He must be like the rock, solid, unyielding, immovable. He must appear to have been there where he stood for centuries. To have weathered all storms, to have withstood all the elements, to have rebuffed all onslaughts. It was important that his body looked hard, full of strength. His strokes must be sure, confident, secure. He must put doubt in the other's mind, doubt of his ability to breach this solid wall, doubt of the superiority of his own skills. Any hairline crack of doubt must be widened to a gulf. His self-assurance must be the greater. He must be both the irresistible force and the immovable object, two in one. There was a brief exchange of thrusts and parries. The Kurgan said,
"He taught you well."
It was a grudging compliment, but MacLeod knew he had surprised the Kurgan thus far. There was an inscription in Sanskrit on MacLeod's sword hilt. "I cannot cross another river." He repeated it to himself to give himself spiritual strength. It meant that he had a task to do, a single task. It was necessary to put his whole mind, his whole being, into the execution of that single task. All other thoughts, missions, desires, needs, concerns must be put out of his mind until he had crossed the river that swirled about his ankles. The next river must be blanked from his mind. He could not think about Brenda or the danger she was in. He had to think only of crossing the river of the moment. That river was the Kurgan. The swords clashed again, the Kurgan trying to force MacLeod to the edge of the roof. Somewhere above them, Brenda was calling, but MacLeod took no notice. He concentrated on stemming the flood of blows and returning some of his own, to worry the opponent. Attitude. His was better. The Kurgan had more technical skill, but lacked improvisation, spontaneity, inspiration. "I cannot cross another river." Intrinsic strength. The swords lock, part. The Kurgan ducks and weaves. MacLeod follows through, misses. There is a clash of blades below the water tower. The Kurgan sword skims MacLeod's head as the latter ducks. It bites into one of the supports to the tower. The structure begins to buckle. Brenda screamed. It seemed for a moment that the water tower was falling her way. It teetered for a second as the two Immortals fought beneath its weakening legs, then suddenly lurched to the side and came crashing down on the roof. Floods of water gushed from the fracture, the white torrent sweeping the two men off their feet. For the moment, the fight had to be abandoned as they struggled in the foaming waters that poured from the ruptured tank. Thousands of gallons rushed towards the edge of the building and formed instant Niagaras and Angel Falls. MacLeod struggled to his feet, in real danger of being swept over the edge of the building. The Kurgan held on to a support, allowing the floodwaters to take his feet for a moment. Neither man could reach each other as the current swirled around the rooftop, but gradually the waters subsided until they were only ankle deep, and the fighters began to assess their relative positions again. MacLeod was nearest to the scaffolding, and he began to climb, to get to the height advantage when the Kurgan was forced to follow. The Kurgan was very quick. His sword slashed at MacLeod's ankles as the Highlander tried to gain one of the platforms. Luckily, the Kurgan's blade cut through a power cable, and for the moment the air was full of sparks and black smoke, the live end snaking through the air and fizzing out its high charge. Though the cable was not of any consequential danger to the Kurgan, he nevertheless avoided it. It would hamper his movements. MacLeod waited in the darkness, below the SIL of the sign. The Kurgan made the ledge and ran towards him. Their blades glanced from one another with a ring of steel. MacLeod's weapon slid down the other, over the hilt of the broadsword, and dug deeply between the fingers of the Kurgan's right hand. The Kurgan grunted in pain. For a moment it appeared that MacLeod's sword would not budge, that it was stuck in the bones of the Kurgan's hand. But then it came free. The Kurgan quickly recovered. The Kurgan kicked out. His foot found MacLeod's thigh, but he overbalanced. The Kurgan fell, crashing between the scaffolding poles. His head struck a horizontal support, his arms and legs flailing as he tried to break his fall. He hit the roof with a thump, knocking the wind from his body. MacLeod was too high to get to the Kurgan in time to take advantage of the fall. He saw the Kurgan climb to his feet and recover quickly. There was nothing to do but wait until the Kurgan climbed up again. The Kurgan had no such intention. Instead, he would bring MacLeod down to the roof. He began running along the supports to the framework and, using all his strength, cutting through them with the broadsword. Each pole buckled or was severed by the heavy blows. The silver cup scaffolding began to bend outwards. Brenda screamed, fighting with her ropes, trying to free herself. MacLeod worked his way along the poles as they began to loosen or crumple. The S from the sign crashed to the ground, its neon tubing shattering in brilliant showers of glass. Then the C came down, exploding in the shallow waters. Wires snapped and lashed out into the air. Cables broke like over-taut bowstrings, whipping at the poles. The structure creaked and groaned, its weight unevenly distributed now. Metal collars whined out into the night as they were catapulted from poles suddenly released from high tension. Pole strained against pole. Then the total collapse. MacLeod went flying off into the darkness like a pebble from a slingshot. He landed on the far side of the roof from the Kurgan, debris falling all around him. Brenda, still strapped to the poles, ended up about 6 feet from the ground, hanging on the bent supports like a dangling crucifix. She worked free from her bonds and fell to the rooftop, relatively unhurt. The debris still rained down in showers of splintered glass and fragments of metal. Poles fell like tall cut pines, crashing around all 3 people. there was a jungle of metal left. MacLeod and the Kurgan struggled through the criss-crossing pipes, some bent to fantastic angles, to get to each other again. As soon as they were within striking distance, the swords flashed out, sometimes hitting ironwork or becoming entangled in a cable. It was an impossible place for a sword fight, and both men knew it. They fought to the edge of the parapet. MacLeod was there first, using the height advantage to hack down, raining blows on the Kurgan's head. Then the Kurgan was up beside him. They were both aware of the drop. Their eyes locked. The Kurgan cried,
"You're weakening. I can see you weakening, Highlander."
MacLeod responded positively. "I am too strong for you. You thought it would be easy, didn't you? Now you realize I am too strong. Too late. You're going to die." The Kurgan responded with another flurry of strokes. But MacLeod could tell that his enemy was not as confident as he had been once. MacLeod was the underdog, and the underdog survives by proving himself a greater obstacle than previously believed to be. If he could just keep the Kurgan back, protect himself, the Kurgan would begin to doubt. Above them, the stars swam. They both reached out for the influx of energy from the night sky. It flowed, crackling along the parapet, through the shallow waters lapping within the roof. Energy. They called the quickening to themselves. Lightning arced through the darkness, filling both men with new strength. The parapet danced with live energy.
"Now,"
said the Kurgan. The swings from the broadsword came thick and fast, as MacLeod felt himself being forced backwards, towards the skylight to the studio below. Suddenly, he found himself right on the edge of the glass. His feet went from under him. He reached out and grabbed the Kurgan by the jacket, pulling him with him. The pair of them fell, struggling through the glass, to crash down onto the studio floor beneath. MacLeod's sword landed a few feet away. The Kurgan was first on his knees and then upright before MacLeod could recover his weapon. The Kurgan kicked the samurai sword, sending it spinning through the fragments of glass. MacLeod was on one knee as the Kurgan closed. The Scot reached up and grabbed the wrist of the giant as he tried to take a swing at the Highlander's head. Gradually, MacLeod managed to climb to his feet, still forcing the Kurgan's arm backwards. The Kurgan broke free. For the first time in the fight, MacLeod felt entirely vulnerable. The Kurgan saw it in his eyes.
"So now it ends,"
said the giant. MacLeod took a step backwards as the Kurgan prepared to swing. At that moment, Brenda came up behind the Kurgan and struck him with a piece of metal pole. The Kurgan staggered sideways. MacLeod ran across the glass-strewn floor. He found his sword in the moonlight. The Kurgan gripped Brenda by the clothes and flung her at MacLeod, who caught her in his arms. "What kept you?" he asked frivolously. A new strength had entered MacLeod now. The Kurgan had had his chance, and failed. Now it was the Highlander's turn. He stepped forward confidently while Brenda found the deep shadow at the edge of the studio. The swords locked. There was a frown on the face of the Kurgan. A thick, deep line marred his facial expression. The sword edges scythed along one another, causing a shower of sparks. MacLeod's blade continued past the hilt of the sword to slash deeply into the leather jacket of the Kurgan. MacLeod could feel the bladed edge slicing through flesh. The Kurgan staggered backwards. Pain, annoyance, and a certain puzzlement fighting for possession of his face. The split tunic flapped open, revealing a red gash, dripping flesh. The Kurgan was distracted by his wound. His left hand went to it as he, ineffectively, tried to parry another blow. This time, the cut was across the chest, the blows getting higher, closer to the neck. Blood ran along the line of the slash, red staining the black leather.
"How?"
said the Kurgan. He slashed wildly at MacLeod. The effort was desperate and ineffective. MacLeod saw the frustration and recognized the lack of conviction behind the blow. The Highlander felt the exhilarating headiness of victory surging through him. He knew, at that moment, he knew that the Kurgan was finished. The vitality had all been drained from the giant figure. He was concerned with his wounds. He paused to consider his pain. That was enough for MacLeod. The bright samurai blade flashed out. The tight grain of the wakizashi short sword, with its undulating temper line, impacted with flesh. It sliced through the soft tissue of the Kurgan's throat. The Kurgan looked surprised. For one moment, MacLeod was not sure that the cut had been deep enough. Then the head lolled backwards. The cut was almost along the same line as the Ramirez wound, but this time it was deeper, much deeper. The spinal cord had been severed. Only a thin strip of skin prevented the head from falling to the floor. It hung there, dangled from the cord of flesh. Yet the Kurgan was still not dead. The mouth flapped, though no sound came out. From the open neck, the exposed stump, energy gushed forth. The body danced and jerked as if on live strings. The wound coruscated like electrified glass. The Kurgan dropped to his knees. MacLeod was amazed at the tenacity of the man. Still, he clung on to life. Still, he fought against death. His head flopped on the narrow bridge of skin, yet the body fought to stay upright. The strength of will behind such action was phenomenal. The hands opened and closed. MacLeod thought that his enemy was going to reach up and replace the severed head on its stump. But the final gush of energy died. The body collapsed. It lay twitching at MacLeod's feet. Finally, it was still. MacLeod stood for a moment in silence. He felt a conflict of emotions. Relief battled with supreme egotism. He had triumphed. The Kurgan was defeated. He was the one. There could be only one, and he was the solitary survivor. "I am the one!" he cried, holding the samurai sword aloft. "Me!" Then he was overcome with humility. He had not done it on his own. He had been helped by others. Heather, Ramirez, Brenda. All had played their part. MacLeod's strength, his superiority over the Kurgan, had been in his ability to trust in others. The Kurgan's weakness was in the fact that he had stood alone. Not because he was stronger alone, but because his fear of betrayal was greater than his trust. He had had faith only in himself. MacLeod stood in silence. MacLeod stood with head bowed, incandescent. MacLeod awaited the quickening. it came. Windows began to implode. The whole studio shook, and Brenda screamed, cowering in a corner, as a blizzard of glass filled the room. The energy was now visible in the air, flowing through the storm of powdered glass. There was a swirling circular motion to the energy, as it formed itself into a maelstrom, a vortex. MacLeod felt the power blazing through him, burning through his veins, searing through his spirit. His whole being was alive, glowing with the reward of his success. He felt light. He was lifted from his feet through the eye of the vortex, lifted high above the floor. Hidden from Brenda's view by the swirling white dust of the glass. The pain and the pleasure mingled. His brain was full of colours, full of light. He could hear himself screaming, the wind and the rain of energy still lashing into his body. He felt godlike, yet undergoing the punishment of a god. Then he blacked out. When he came back to consciousness, his head was resting on Brenda's knee. They were both sprawled over the floor of the studio, and she was stroking his brow. "Are you all right?" she said. "Yes. Are you unhurt?" I think so." He smiled up at her. "It's over. It's all over." They both looked at the body of the Kurgan, lying like a broken doll amongst the shards of glass. "Is he really dead?" whispered Brenda. MacLeod nodded. "At last," he said. "At last."